Hey, everybody, you are listening to Renewal Cast, a weekly podcast that features interviews, discussions, teaching on various biblical and theological subjects. And we do this because we believe that our minds are to be shaped and renewed by the life-giving and transforming Word of God through the power of the Holy Spirit. So we pray that for the next few minutes as you listen, you will see Jesus more clearly. Today on the podcast, we have a special guest with us. Today, we have Aldo Leon with us, and we're going to talk about federal vision. We're going to explain what that is. We're going to talk about Doug Wilson, who is a somewhat of a polarizing figure these days and falls into that camp. And I think you're really going to benefit from this discussion. So enjoy the show. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Renewal Cast. We got a guest with us today. We're going to talk with Aldo Leon today, and he is joining us. And we're going to talk about federal vision. We're going to talk about Doug Wilson. That's a name that you've probably heard. If you haven't, you probably will. He's popular in some circles. He's polarizing, and some people are just really gravitating to him. So we want to talk about him and his ministry a little bit today and get up to speed on that. So would you just take and tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your ministry, introduce our listeners to who you are?
Cool. So I am a bastard child of the Master's Seminary, John MacArthur, the dispensational school, and somehow I became a Presbyterian in South Florida, in Miami. And it's just very interesting how that works. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And so I currently am the senior teaching elder at Pinelands Presbyterian Church in Miami. I've been here for 2 years. I planted a church 6 years ago. Long story short, they called me as their pastor and I brought my church finance. So it was kind of like an informal merger. I've been in the PCA since 2017. I think I could be wrong, maybe by 6 months or so. Married, have 3 kids, Abriella, Adonias, and Elias. 11, 9, and 4. I'm probably wrong about one of those. And I got a podcast, Kingdom Polemic, but it's currently branded as Gospel, but I'm rebranding it. And I guess that's like the clip notes of me.
Okay, sounds great. So let's get into this a little bit. What is federal vision in a nutshell? I know there was some documents back in 2002-ish that came out and kind of defined what that was. But can you kind of give us
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the premise behind federal vision, the so-called premise, was that there was a lot of pietism in the churches and too much subjectivity in the churches about who is really in the church. And so what they were saying that they were was recapturing the objectivity of the covenant. And so federal vision seeks to so-called provide objectivity for being in the covenant. Basically, everybody who's baptized is in, they're fully in. And so that's kind of like the premise of federal vision. They wanted to, I guess, from their end, to provide more objectivity, and they believe in a world that was becoming way too subjective. And on top of that, wanting to be more objective about the covenant by basically putting everybody in forensically by baptism, they then had some other things that they wanted to add to Reformed theology that they felt were lacking. And that was the postmillennialism of the theorecons and also the cultural transference of bent and whatnot. So we're trying to recapture the objectivity of the covenant, and we're trying to recapture, I say recapture, we're trying to build on the momentum of the theorecon movement of the 60s and 70s with, the Norse and all these folks. So that's the charitable version. They believe that they are the true reformers that are consistent with Westminster Divines. They believe that the Westminster, Jared Longsworth said that he believes that Westminster theology has been lost across the ocean. And they are those who have truly recaptured the objectivity and the kingdom comprehensiveness of the Westminster Divine. So that's how they would describe themselves, I believe. But that's their nutshell. We want to recapture the objectivity of the covenant. We believe that most Presbyterians are more like Baptists. They don't believe in the objectivity of the covenant. They don't believe in the true power and efficacy of the sacraments. They're very subjective, and basically we're quasi-Baptist. Most of us in the PCA are quasi-Baptist because we don't give sacraments. We don't give a communion to our kids until they profess faith. So that's the gist of how they would describe themselves, I would say.
So now the little more unfavorable side.
Yeah. So some people would describe them Lutherans in the Presbyterian world. I think that's too kind. If I were to summarize Federal Vision, it is a repackaging of the remonstrants that are dealt with in the canons of Dort. It is a repackaged version of medieval Catholicism with Protestant dress. Federal Vision is a repackaging of medieval Catholicism. It is a child of Norman Shepherd and the Shepherdite movements. Shepherd was a person who was removed from Westminster Seminary for his less than orthodox views of covenant and justification. Federal Vision is, I would say that would be the way I would see it. To call them Lutheran would be too charitable because Lutherans got justification right. The Federal Visionists don't get justification right. So that's how I would summarize them. They're medieval Catholics wearing Protestant clothes, using our language and our rhetoric and our standard intertwined with their sacerdotal view of covenant and sacraments. So basically, another way I would say it is that the Federal Vision movement, in seeking to be more objective, they actually put every Christian into a probationary, potential, possible framework by which, if due to their cooperation, due to their covenant faithfulness, they might possibly find themselves ultimately in final justification. So it's just, to me, another way I would say it, if you guys are familiar with the New Perspective on Paul, the New Perspective on Paul is medieval Catholicism in Protestant dress for intellectual elites and cultural elites. Federal Vision is medieval Catholicism for working class folks. Now that's how it's very, very similar. They're kind of like definitions of covenant and justification and covenant faithfulness and monocovenantalism, all that stuff. So that's how I see them. I see the Federal Vision as not as, I don't see them as Arminians because Arminians, I believe, can and are often in the covenant family of the elect because they may have wrong views about how we're converted. They may believe that some may believe you can lose your salvation, but at least their doctrine of justification by faith alone oftentimes can be intact. The Federal Visionists, they corrupt the doctrine of election, they corrupt the doctrine of justification, they corrupt the doctrine of sola fide, they corrupt the doctrine of the perseverance. I mean, pretty much wherever there's a sociological doctrine that is Protestant, they have a spin-off version of it that kind of makes it synergistic. So they miss like on every part of like the puzzle, as opposed to other people miss in some parts. So yeah.
So this is a movement, at least it started in Presbyterian circles and it's covenantal. So how did the denominations respond to it?
Well, let me just tell you what they didn't say first. They didn't say that these guys they're just a different version of the NAPARC world. I don't know if you guys know the NAPARC world in your podcast, but NAPARC is like pretty much the Reformed denominations that haven't lost their minds and are ordained like homosexuals, and it's conservative Presbyterian. And we wouldn't describe. We didn't see them as, well, they're probably like the RPCNA. RPCNA are the guys that only sing psalms and they have no instrument. They're different Presbyterians than the PCR. They didn't see them that way. The response of the Federal Vision movement, and by the way, it started in the PCA, and I think a lot of it started in the PCA. A lot of interesting things start in the PCA. Start in the PCA. Revoice starts in the PCA. And it's funny because a lot of this oftentimes is radiating around St. Louis and that presbytery, because the Federal Vision was very popular in the Missouri Presbytery. Another interesting coincidence. So our response, we evaluated it. We did a study committee report on it, and we found it to be comprehensively out of the bounds of orthodoxy. And there was pretty much every NAPARC denomination took a a negative stance against the federal vision, but the OPC, the URC, the PCA, and the RCUS wrote formal statements and documents about the federal vision, and all of them rejected it entirely. And we started to indict them and do church discipline and court cases on them. You can see a few court cases with Peter Leithart was one of them. He was one of the people that we had a case about, and also the Lawrence case as well in the Siouxlands Presbytery. Sad to say, we didn't convict those people. Here's what the PCA likes to do. And look, I love the PCA. I'm in the PCA. I care for the PCA. We like to write documents, start some cases, and never actually, oftentimes try to go all the way through with discipline. And so what we did was in the PCA, we wrote documents, we took stands, we made statements that this is outside of the bounds of orthodoxy because they get soteriology wrong. And we had some court cases, and those people eventually left. And guess where every federal vision person usually ends up going when they leave a NAPARC denomination? The CREC, which is, Dougie's baby that he formed around himself. And so that was the response of the NAPARC world. So when I talk to people who have an issue with me saying what I say about Doug Wilson, and they act like, you don't understand Doug, and you're just a Doug hater, I'm like, okay, we have close to, I don't know how many, maybe let's guess. That's maybe 600,000 Presbyterians amongst all those denominations that collectively and cohesively made formal statements about the great error of these people. So it's not just a few people that are Doug haters. This is a very comprehensive statement amongst multiple generations. So yeah, we responded firmly, but I don't think we responded firmly enough. I think we were soft on going all the way on Peter Leithart and the other case. But we did blow up a presbytery. The presbytery where all this kind of started was in Louisiana. And that was that had that Federal Vision conference with Dougie and his friends. And the cases and the things that were in did blow up that presbytery that was very Federal Vision saturated. So that's kind of just, our response was firm, but it could have been stronger. But it was pretty consistent across the board.
Yeah, you talked about dressed up Roman Catholics. Maybe could you just explain a little bit? Because that's a pretty serious. This is a pretty serious issue. This isn't just nuance, and it's terribly confusing. And we'll get into that a little bit when we get more into Doug Wilson, I think. But why is this issue so important? What is it about the justification that they get wrong?
Yeah. So when I say medieval Catholic, it's not Pelagian, where you're talking about man autonomously by himself, in himself, finding grace. Grace is the starting point. You need God's grace, but your cooperation and the subsequent virtue and conditionality that you provide is the finally. So in Federal Vision, you're initially justified before God, all of grace, but you're finally justified by covenant. You're initially elect by God's grace, but you're finally elect. They have these categories of initial and final. You're initially a Christian by grace. It's funny, Christians can be damned because in their soteriology, look, if you're baptized, this is what the Federal Vision says. If you're baptized, you have all the benefits of Christ. It's not, if you're baptized, you've been initiated into the covenant community and you can benefit from the means of grace. You have all the benefits of Christ. This is what they say, which means you have justification, adoption, regeneration, and obviously the benefit of sanctification. And so imagine this, if you're baptized as an infant and you have all the benefits of Christ, you're united Christ. You're actually united Christ. You're actually justified because I believe baptism truly gives what it declares. Now, in our world of reform, we say that baptism is a sign and seal of union with Christ. But in the Federal Vision world, baptism gives you all the benefits of Christ. But the key is it gives it to you temporarily. It gives it to you provisionally. It gives it to you contingently. So when they said, this is what's tricky, and I'm getting ahead of myself, because when you talk about the initial, how does someone get in the covenant community? How does someone get justified? How does somebody get adopted, right? Yes, it's all grace language, right? But that is a first stage, which is contingent upon the ongoing cooperation. So we know when people renounce Christ, like whether you're Baptist Reformed or Presby Reformed, it's like, yeah, they went out from us. They never were of us. It was a false profession. But in the federal vision world, you renounce Christianity, you literally lose your justification, you lose your regeneration, you lose your union with Christ, because when you're baptized, you are united to Christ. So basically, grace is this restart where second chance, you get in all of grace, but you get a second chance to get finally and fully in by covenant faithfulness, by cooperation. And they like to cite the Westminster Divines language about living faith, Calvin saying living faith and faith is always followed by works, but they're not talking about that. They're not talking about genuine faith is always followed by true works. These works are the temporary instrument by which you may get finally in, right? So my obedience is not a consequence. My obedience is a consequence of being saved by faith alone, in Christ alone, apart from works. It is a consequence. In the federal vision universe, faith and your obedience is a contingent instrument by which you can go from initially justified to final. And the way they articulate it sometimes is guys like Doug will say corporate justification, corporate election and corporate justification has all the grace language. So you're corporately elect by grace. You're corporately justified by grace. But individually and personally, there is a contingency factor. There is a subsequent, furthering that process. And they're very good at selling you the front door. So the front door of federal vision is very much grace clear. It's very clear. And a lot of people hear that part and they'll hear Doug Wilson explain that part. But the thing is, between the front door and the back door, there's a U factor that is very much medieval Roman. And whenever there's a U factor in justification, whenever there's a U factor in election, there's a no factor in salvation. So it is very serious because it pretty much makes the covenant of grace into a modified covenant of works. And that is because they deny the historic, traditional covenant of works, covenant of grace framework. They believe that the original covenant by which God made with man was a covenant of grace. Now imagine this. If the original covenant God makes with man is a covenant of grace, Adam got kicked out of the garden, exiled in that covenant. So basically, if that's the framework, then grace is always, I start something by my kindness and generosity and freeness, but your cooperation is the X factor to make it fully and final. And so it is, they pretty much, wherever there's a place to be clear about how you're right with God, they infuse it with this second subsequent category of cooperation on the back door, where you lose the front door and the back door by the way they walk you through it. So
yeah, it sounds like they got the law gospel distinction pretty muddled up there.
Yeah. And in their joint federal vision statement, which Doug wrote and signed, they deny this law gospel distinction. And Doug explains this. He says, any text can be law or gospel to you depending on how you read it. Sounds very Barthian to me. So basically, if I read the rich young ruler be told, do these things and you will enter into life. If I read that as gospel, it's gospel. So basically, law, the text being objective, objectively gospel or law, that's not a category they have. And so basically everything can be gospel or everything can be law or gospel. So pretty much whatever you want a text to be. So if you see there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ, if you see that as law, that could be law to you. They also, in their joint federal statement that Doug signed and made and has never renounced, they say, we deny that faith demands such a formulation of the imputation of the active obedience of Christ. This is something that the New Perspective on Paul is very regular about. So they deny also, it's funny, they affirm and deny things, but in their statements, they deny that you have to see your righteousness as being grounded in the righteous life and acts of Christ that you get credit for. They believe in single imputation being the only thing that a Christian needs to. Now, it's one thing. Look, it's one thing if a Christian it doesn't get double imputation, right? And they're not working to. It's another thing for you as a pastor to say we deny our justification based on the imputation of Christ actual. To say that is very serious, and the reason why you deny that factor is because you got to make space for the righteousness of the believer that he works out to be the ground of your justification. Whenever the ground is not Christ's righteousness, you're making space for somebody else's. So yeah, it's just someone was trying to like anesthetize this whole thing. And I'm listening. Wherever you look at the web, there is something that has been hijacked and redefined to basically rid the Christian faith of their gospel foundation. But it's tricky because they're really good at affirming and denying things at the same time. They have a dialectical. Have you ever met these church where they're with one group of people and they say exactly what those people want to hear, and then they're in another group of people and they say exactly what those people want to hear. So you're saying different things, different people, and then both people are confused about it. Well, I'm hearing this, and I'm hearing this, and it's like, well, that's what people do when they're not being genuine about what they're about, right?
Yeah, it's like a chess game trying to figure out what somebody's saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, one of the things I said and when I was addressing this is that the gospel minister makes the gospel clear. He unveils the mystery of the gospel. And whenever you find these new perspective guys and these federal vision guys that are always confusing everybody and no one understands them, that can't possibly be gospel ministry, because gospel ministry is utterly clear and precise, right? And if you're always misunderstood, okay, first of all, you sound like some millennial teenager, like no one gets it but me. But you're a gospel minister because, man, when the true gospel, it becomes utterly clear what grace is and what salvation is. If you're always confusing pastors, ministers, at church, it's not because you're just this unicorn Orthodox person that just confuses like so many people, because you're shady. You're a shapeshift. Anyway,
that's right. I just give you one example. In our denomination, we had a whole discussion on the atonement a few years ago, and we had a leader in the denomination wrote a big article on the atonement and talked about how the atonement was substitutionary, but he meant everything other than substitutionary, how it should be defined. So you're using this language on one side because you're going to sound orthodox and right, but that's not what you mean. And you don't mean penal substitutionary atonement. You don't mean that doctrine. And that's, like you said, that's shady. That's using language on one side. And
this is the issue with the progressives in our denominations or the federal visionists, is they're using our vocabulary, but it's from a different dictionary.
That's right. And I think that we need to be aware of that. Just because somebody says justification by faith alone doesn't mean that they're coming back on the other side and adding works into the end.
Yeah. So I would talk, if I was talking, I said, when you say justification by faith alone, do you mean initial justification? Do you mean corporate justification? When you hear the whole conversation, that phrase has these other qualifiers. And Doug Wilson is really good at creating a third category. So he doesn't want, so here's a category, right? And it's either like this category or against. And he's like, well, I got a third one. So I'm not against the whole visible and invisible church. I prefer this third category, which is historical and eschatological church. I'm not against like unconditional election and invisible church, all these things, but I prefer covenant election. So he has like a third way of describing something which doesn't actually affirm the concept or deny the concept. It's the way he is. I'm not even familiar with it, like Tim Keller is like the Jedi master of this third wayism and like in the PC. Like Dougie is the master of, it's not really this, it's really this, but it's this. It's funny because Doug, he'll tell you, he got it. If you ask him where he got his federal vision from, he got it from Calvin, he says. If you ask him, hey, why do you believe that baptism is grace? Okay. He's like, well, I got that from the Westminster Divines. And it's like, interesting, because the Divines didn't get that from themselves. I mean, I don't know, but you got that from the Divines. I don't know about you guys. There's people to see themselves all throughout church history where where they're not there. Actually, it's like you see what you want to see. But Doug has never had been ordained in a Reformed denomination. He was a non-denominational guy, and then he decided to become a Reformed Baptist, and then he decided to be this whole CRC just forms, and we don't even. It's funny to your audience. I would challenge. Go look at the story of how the CRE started. There's no story. Well, I guess if you can't get in an actual NAPARC denomination that has historic roots all the way back, to England, if you trace it, if you can't get in, I guess you got to make your own. And what's clever about it is that the CR. Here's what's tricky is the CREC has convinced a lot of actual Orthodox people to join them. So there's a pot where there's real pastors that are there because, like, I don't know, Doug's fighting the fight, and he's punching the woke people in the face, and he's making men be men, and so there's a whole lot of people in that pot of federal visionists that actually aren't federal visionists, but they've joined the culture war for the cause of the culture war, which is not exactly suspending like orthodoxy for the cause of some cultural issue is always not. It's not a good idea, but you guys. Probably some of the reason why you're doing this is that a lot of people are saying, I don't really know what he believes. I don't really know federal vision, but you know what? Like, I really like how he spoke up against COVID, and I really like how he's talking about like masculinity, so I'm like, well, I delivered to you that which is the first important, that Christ died for our sins. I mean, that has to be the architectonic central governing principle of anything that we're talking about, because if we don't have first things clear, then you'll never be able to work things out in a long-term healthy way if they're built on some shaky foundation that isn't built on the clarity of those first things. But yeah, these guys are novel. They're very novel in their views and very dangerous. So
he's kind of come into Reformed Baptist circles too, with his working with James White, and then he stole Jared Longshore from Founders, and
and that goes back to like there's an appeal, like it's like a Doug. He has an ability to attract. He has an eclectic kind of attraction, because the non-denominational Christian, the Baptist Christian, the Reformed Baptist Christian, the Presbyterian Christian, man, like this guy is about something. Like he's doing something. Like he's like the courageous hero in this day and age, compromise, and he definitely has. And you know what? I don't know how you guys feel about this. I think that part of his appeal is that a lot of us have left a massive vacuum as Christian leaders that it inevitably will lead to something less than ideal filling it. We have, I think, a piety and pietism that is superficial, oversimplistic, and less than comprehensive. And I think that it's left the church vulnerable to people that are less than ideal, like wokeism, and I call Moscow folks like the reverse woke. They're like the right wing woke people, and you can see this with that new book by Stephen Wolfe, like Christian nationalism. They're kind of like the reverse. When you leave this huge vacuum about the comprehensive kingship of Christ and the piety of the Christian, and kind of like God's purpose for the home, like I think you leave a vacuum that guys like this will fill. So his popularity, I think, is partially a legitimate indictment, I think, on a lot of the church. That's one of the things that I brought up as I talked about it. So yeah, a lot of people are going to Moscow and into Canon Press for different reasons.
We've kind of talked about Doug Wilson as part of this Federal Vision camp, but is there a little bit of confusion on that? I mean, does some kind of say, well, no, wait a minute, he's renounced that, he's not?
Yeah, he never renounced Federal Vision. This is the thing, like people, like I looked at Doug Wilson about 6 years, I think, before I said something about Doug Wilson. I actually liked him for a while. I was like, I want to like this guy. I want to like this guy. And so, yeah, he never renounced federal theology. He never renounced any of the documents that he's written or been a part of. He said, I renounce no mas, that article. He renounced the fact that he would identify and call himself as Federal Visionist. So he never renounced the theology of Federal Vision. He never renounced the documents. Secondly, he is still in the denomination where all the Federal Visionists are being housed. So that's number two. Number three, his chief theologian at his at his seminary for many, many years was Peter Leithart, who is like the prince of Federal Vision, right? So if all of your confidants and circles and comrades, ecclesiologically speaking, all your circles, even your denominational circles, are Federal Visionists, how exactly is that I'm not Federal Vision? Well, you're still like in the cesspool of Federal Visionists, and they're still like, you still have them teaching at your institutions. Also, the only thing that he has done, this is the thing about Doug Wilson. When you ask him a direct question, he gives you some story about eggs and beer, right, as the answer. So he says, there's stout Federal Vision, and I'm pale ale Federal Vision. That was what he renounced FV as. So my question is, what is stout Federal Vision, and what is pale ale Federal Vision? Because you just told me like I'm just a certain favor of beer. I don't even know what. Can you tell me the contents of it? And furthermore, he said, I don't think that any Federal Vision is heretical. So he says, I'm pale ale Federal Vision. I'm not stout Federal Vision, but I don't believe that any Federal Vision is heretical. So again, like, what exactly did you denounce? What exactly do you affirm? All you basically said is that Federal Vision is not heretical, and I am a certain flavor of Federal Vision, and I won't call myself Federal Vision. So if anybody actually believes that Doug Wilson has renounced the doctrines of Federal Vision, given what he has said and his particular affiliation, I think they either are unaware of this and they need to be more informed, or they just don't care. They don't care. Like, I mean, because he has not renounced Federal Vision at all. He just doesn't want to call himself that because it gets him in trouble, and it gets people writing things and saying things. So he's like, I don't want to call myself that. It's almost like I'm a Roman Catholic, but I'm not going to call myself a Roman Catholic anymore. And I'm not the stout Roman Catholic. I'm like the low calorie beer Roman Catholic. So what exactly is the stout Roman Catholic? Can you tell us what the stout one is? Can you tell us what the low calorie Roman Catholic is? So there's like no clarity at all about it, And I think part of the reason why people maybe are too quick to accept these kind of like very superficial like disassociations is because kind of like the story in that movie Catch Me If You Can. And this is the reason why the Yankees always win is people can't get their eyes off the pinstripes. I feel like his eloquence and his witty statements and his aha gotchas, like it's like people can't even hear what's being said because he's like kind of like Jedi mastering them with all these like witty statements and pithy gotchas and aha and yeah, what about Greg Johnson and like the gay pastor, and like so he's really good at like I think wowing people with his language. But if you actually listen, well, what's funny? I'll tell you something funny. I did a few episodes on television, and a lot of people heard them. They got pretty far, and I guess eventually, like the FB guys started hearing about it, and like all like the FB supporters of Doug, that guy A.E. Robles and Joel Webben, and they all started like coming out with like things defending him. And finally, Doug came out and said something, and like my wife listened to it, and I was like, "Hey, what do you think?" He's like, "That guy didn't say anything for 15 minutes." And I was like, yeah. That says it, man.
Yeah. Well, and I think that those people, from what my limited point here, those people that would come out and say, well, wait a minute, I mean, he's Orthodox, it's because they listen to him define justification by faith, and it sounds really good, but they're not getting the whole picture like we've talked about.
Yeah. And it's like every false teacher has been able to orthodoxy in some way that was, articulate. Like, no, like, I mean, just even like the early church heresies against Arian heresies. Yeah, those guys could talk about the natures of Christ in an orthodox way, but they had a way of like adding a little spin on it. So, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised that people that would teach false doctrine could and often can convey things well. I mean, I don't know. Like, I think we're looking for false teachers to walk around in the crown and horns and be saying, Jesus is like a homosexual and like, I mean, it's not how Satan only works. As close as you can get to the thing without being the thing is very effective. And I think the problem with me and Doug Wilson is that he's claiming to be one of us. That's what makes it very dangerous. If he was, I don't know, if someone's like, hey, he's like a Ben Shapiro, you know, he's like a Matt Walsh kind of guy, you know, he's not. I don't think he's promoting Christianity, but like, bro, he's got some good cultural commentary. I'm fine with that. But it's like, no, this is like a Westminsterian theologian who's going to bring Geneva 2.0 to America. So that's where it becomes dangerous, because people don't see him as a cultural commentator. They see him as a legit confessional guy.
Well, if our listeners want to look into this issue more, if they want to look into Doug Wilson or just Federal Vision in general, do you point us to a resource or two?
I would say a few things. First, don't just read Doug. Read the people in his circle. Read Jeff Myers. Read Steve Wilkins. Read Peter Lightheart. Read James Jordan. Read John Barak. These are people in his circle, and they articulate things as well in that web. I would also say, listen to his stuff throughout the years. It's all on the internet, and read his book. Reformed is not enough. If that's not a dead giveaway, Reformed is not enough. And read it very, very carefully and very slowly. But I think the most helpful book theologically to critique like the whole system and to go through not just Doug Wilson, but a lot of these guys I mentioned. You can read a whole lot of stuff, but if you read Federal Vision and Covenant Theology by Guy Waters, that'll really give you the picture of it. That's probably like, there's a lot of stuff you can read about Federal Vision. Obviously, Scott Clark is like, his whole ministry is Doug Wilson. So the Heidel blog has a lot of resources there, but I really like Guy Waters' book on Federal Vision and Covenant Theology, because he went through the whole web of guys and went through primary sources very well, and he compared it to like the Westminster Standards very well. That to me was the most helpful. So yeah.
JV Fesca wrote a book review on Reformed is Not Enough. That is very helpful too. I think we actually have that on Renewal blog.
I haven't read that one, but JV Fesca writes pretty good stuff. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time today and joining us. We really appreciate that, and it was really helpful to me, and I know that it'll be helpful to our listeners too. So
sure, no problem. Stay away from that FV, man. Stay away from that.
All right.
Moscow, no bueno.
All right. Yeah, thanks. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. You can find more out about us or check out past episodes on the web at renewalcast.com. You can connect with us on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/renewalcast. Have a great week.